In the span of a single night, 40 F-35 Adir fighter aircraft, the crown jewel of Israeli air superiority, each worth well over $100 million, were destroyed on the ground before a single pilot could even reach a cockpit. $4 billion in American-built aerospace technology vanished in darkness, not at the hands of a military power with aircraft carriers and global satellite constellations. At the hands of Iran, a nation Washington has spent 5 decades trying to constrict through sanctions, covert action, and relentless diplomatic pressure. That is what makes this moment so hard to absorb. Because this is not just a battlefield loss. It is a shock to the entire logic of air superiority, deterrence, and the balance of power people thought it was still held. The instrument of destruction was the Fateh 360, a precision ballistic missile system that much of the Western defense establishment had largely dismissed as a regional nuisance, a short-range weapon, a propaganda piece, a system to be intercepted, neutralized, and managed. Last night, that complacency carried a price. It cost Israel its forward strike capacity in a single operational window. Nevatim Air Base, the primary home of Israel's F-35 fleet and the launch point for some of its most consequential regional air operations, was hit by a coordinated salvo so precise, so tightly compressed in time, and so overwhelming in volume that Iron Dome, David Sling, and every other layer of the Israeli defensive architecture failed to prevent catastrophe. By the time the smoke cleared over the Negev, the strategic equation of the Middle East had changed. Israel entered the night as the dominant air power in the region. It emerged from the night with that dominance deeply shattered. And Washington, which for half a century had treated Israel's qualitative military edge as a pillar of American regional strategy, suddenly found itself staring at a security gap no emergency resupply can close overnight. Tonight's analysis takes you inside the strike. We will break down the Fateh 360's technical architecture and why it defeated every defense system arrayed against it. We will examine how Iran planned and executed a simultaneous multi-base assault without triggering an adequate early warning response until it was too late. We will assess what the loss of 40F to 35S means for Israel's ability to continue operating across every theater in which it is engaged. And we will map the geopolitical shockwave now radiating outward from this single night, reaching Washington, Moscow, Beijing, and every Gulf capital at once. The truth of what happened last night is more consequential than much of the mainstream defense media is yet willing to say aloud. 3 questions anchor this analysis. First, how did Iran execute a coordinated strike across multiple hardened Israeli air bases simultaneously without triggering an adequate early warning response? Second, what is the Fateh 360 actually capable of, and why did the most expensive missile defense architecture in the Middle East fail to stop it? Third, with Israel's F-35 fleet devastated and its offensive air capacity badly degraded, what comes next? And does Washington have any realistic response that does not risk igniting a wider regional war? The answers are not comfortable, but they are necessary. If you have been following this conflict closely, then you already understand that what we are witnessing is not a series of isolated military incidents. It is a structured, patient, methodically executed campaign to alter the balance of power across the Middle East. Last night was not just another episode in that pattern. It was its most consequential single operation so far. To understand the full magnitude of last night, you first need to understand what Nevatim Air Base actually represents within Israel's military architecture. This is not simply an airfield. Nevatim is the operational heart of Israeli air dominance across the region. It houses the majority of Israel's F-35 Adir fleet aircraft built for stealth penetration, sensor fusion, networked warfare, and deep strike operations that no other air force in the Middle East can match at scale. Every major Israeli airstrike against Iranian-linked targets in Syria in recent years flowed through Nevatim. Every mission against Hezbollah's precision missile infrastructure. Every long-range penetration of contested airspace. Every operation that relied on the assumption that Israel could strike first, strike accurately, and return without meaningful retaliation. That assumption lived at Nevatim. Destroying Nevatim's flight line is not merely destroying aircraft. It is degrading Israel's ability to project offensive power across the entire regional chessboard. Iran understood this with complete clarity. The targeting logic behind last night's strike was not random. It was the product of years of intelligence collection, operational planning, technical refinement, and patient preparation for exactly this moment. The strike began at 2:17 inches the morning local time. That timing was itself deliberate. Israeli air defense crews were at their lowest overnight readiness. Watch rotations had just changed. Processing speed at radar stations and command centers was naturally reduced compared to peak operational hours. This was not a coincidence. Iranian planners selected the launch window based on detailed knowledge of Israeli defense cycles, knowledge accumulated through years of electronic intelligence collection, drone overflights, pattern analysis, and human intelligence networks that Western analysts consistently underestimated. The opening phase involved a wave of decoy UAVs, small, low observable platforms that flooded the radar picture with targets from multiple vectors at once. Israeli air defense networks were suddenly forced to process hundreds of incoming signatures, the systems assigning intercept priorities to Iron Dome and David Sling batteries were thrown into what military systems engineers would describe as a form of saturation paralysis. The network was not off. It was overloaded. Every available battery began cycling through target assignments faster than its reload and engagement logic could comfortably sustain. That was the trap. While interceptors were being committed to the decoy wave, the Fateh 360 salvos were already airborne, not just from Western Iran, but from mobile launch positions pre-positioned through Iraqi territory, exploiting angles that Israeli early warning coverage was not optimally configured to address. The missiles arrived in groups of 8 to 12, directed not at generalized base coordinates, but at specific hardened shelters inside the Nevatim complex. The interval between first impact and last was under 4 minutes. In 4 minutes, there was no realistic path to an effective, coordinated response. By the time the base's internal alert systems were fully processing the initial warning, subsequent salvos were already descending in terminal phase. At the same time, and this is the element that appears to have shocked Israeli command most deeply, a parallel strike package hit Ramon Air Base in the southern Negev, where Israel had quietly repositioned a reserve contingent of F-35S and F-16-1 aircraft as a dispersal measure after earlier warnings of escalation. The fact that Iran knew not only that dispersal had taken place, but knew where within Ramon those aircraft had been relocated, points to an intelligence penetration of Israeli operational security deeper than any official statement has yet openly acknowledged. By 2:47 inches the morning, only 30 minutes after the first launch detection, the assessments reaching Israeli Air Force headquarters contained numbers that commanders reportedly struggled at first to accept: 40 aircraft destroyed or critically damaged, multiple hardened shelter complexes structurally compromised, a primary fuel and ammunition node burning, and dispersal areas at Ramon struck with comparable precision. In practical terms, Israel's offensive air capability, the instrument on which so much of its regional strategy depends, had been crippled in a single half-hour window. The scale of this event is difficult to overstate. In 1967, Israel destroyed rival Arab air forces in a preemptive strike that took hours. Last night, Iran executed the functional equivalent against Israel's most advanced fleet in approximately 30 minutes, using ballistic missiles launched from more than 1,000 kilometers away against an adversary on elevated alert. The precision is the most important military fact of the entire engagement. These missiles were not falling across general base areas. They were striking specific shelter bays. They were not targeting runways or perimeter roads. They were targeting the exact structures in which the F-35S were parked and maintained. That level of terminal accuracy from a ballistic weapon at range demands two things: targeting data of exceptional resolution and guidance technology of exceptional sophistication. Both point toward an uncomfortable conclusion. Iran's precision strike capability has matured far beyond what Western intelligence and defense commentary had publicly been willing to admit. The Fateh 360 entered Western defense analysis circles gradually, and without the level of alarm now clearly warranted. Its reported specifications, roughly 120 kilometers of range, solid fuel propulsion, and a circular error probable in the low-meter range placed it in the category of short to medium-range precision ballistic systems. It was cataloged as tactically significant, but not strategically decisive. Analysts noted it, filed it, and moved on. Last night demolished that assessment. What Western analysts consistently underestimated was not simply the Fateh 360's range. It was the combination of its terminal guidance architecture, its salvo employment doctrine, and the operational ecosystem Iran had quietly built around it, an ecosystem that allowed it to be used not as a battlefield missile in isolation, but as part of a coordinated strike system designed to overwhelm layered defenses. Start with terminal guidance, because this is where the Fateh 360 meaningfully departs from earlier generations of Iranian ballistic weapons. Conventional ballistic missiles, including many older Iranian systems, follow broadly predictable trajectories through most of their flight. They can be tracked. Their probable impact points can be estimated. Interceptors can be assigned based on that predictability. Israel's layered missile defense system was built around that logic. The Fateh 360 complicates that logic in its final phase. As it descends, an onboard guidance package combining inertial navigation, radar altimeter input, and an electro-optical terminal seeker begins comparing the terrain and structures beneath it to a preloaded target model. In other words, this is not simply a missile following coordinates. It is a missile recognizing a specific target environment and adjusting toward a particular point within it. That is what helps explain why impacts clustered inside specific shelter bays rather than across the base generally. It also explains why GPS jamming appears to have had little meaningful effect. Once the terminal seeker is active, the missile is no longer dependent on GPS in the phase that matters most. The propulsion system compounds the challenge. Solid fuel missiles do not require lengthy fueling sequences. A mobile launcher can arrive, erect, and fire within minutes. That compresses warning time dramatically. The thermal and logistical signatures that make liquid fuel systems vulnerable to surveillance and preemption are mostly absent here. Then comes doctrine. A single Fateh 360 can be intercepted. No serious analyst should deny that. Israel's missile defenses remain formidable engineering achievements. But Iran did not fire one missile at one target. It fired salvos. Salvos of 8 to 12 missiles were compressed into narrow launch windows. Multiple batteries appear to have targeted the same facility from different vectors at once. The point was not merely to get a missile through. The point was to create a mathematical overload problem for the defending batteries. A point defense battery can engage some incoming missiles. It cannot engage an unlimited number from multiple vectors inside a tightly compressed time window. If Iran's planners understood the reload cycle, engagement rate, and sector coverage of each battery, then they could size each salvo to exceed available intercept capacity by design. That is not luck. That is systems analysis. The production scale matters too. These are not handcrafted prestige weapons built in tiny quantities. Iran has clearly produced the Fateh 360 at a scale sufficient to create meaningful operational stockpiles. The missiles used last night do not appear to represent a one-off capability demonstration. They appear to represent a sustainable strike architecture, and that brings us to the deeper, more uncomfortable conclusion. Every major component of the Fateh 360 propulsion chemistry, electronics, structure, tooling, and guidance integration was developed and produced under sanctions. The sanctions architecture designed to prevent Iran from developing this kind of capability has, in core strategic terms, failed. Not partially, completely. What sanctions produced was not strategic paralysis. They produced a defense industrial ecosystem forced into self-reliance. Isolation did not prevent innovation, it compelled it. That matters beyond this single missile, because if the Fateh 360 is representative of Iran's broader design, philosophy, precise terminal correction, mobile launch systems, compressed warning timelines, massed salvo doctrine, then the threat environment for every American base, every allied facility, and every high-value asset within Iranian strike range must now be reassessed. That reassessment is happening right now. And the conclusions are not reassuring. Within hours of the Nevatim strike, Washington's crisis machinery was fully engaged. The White House Situation Room was dense with personnel. The National Security Council was in an emergency session. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs was on secure video with CENTCOM. The Secretary of State was working with every Gulf partner simultaneously, and yet the public message that emerged was familiar: concern, reassurance, and a call for restraint. That word restraint landed in Israel with extraordinary force, because what it signaled was not strength, but constraint. To understand Washington's paralysis, you have to look at the operational problem, not just the politics. The standard American escalation management playbook is relatively clear in theory. Demonstrate overwhelming force, reposition carriers, increase bomber presence, signal credible retaliation, use that threat to open diplomatic channels, if necessary, conduct precision strikes that degrade enemy capability without triggering full-scale war. Every stage of that playbook now faces a complication. Carrier presence requires carriers to move into areas where Iranian anti-ship capabilities now pose demonstrated risk. That is no longer a cost-free signal. Retaliation threats work only if Iran believes they will be executed. Last night's strike strongly suggests Tehran believes Washington is constrained. Diplomatic back channels require an adversary who thinks it is in a worsening position. Iran does not appear to see itself that way this morning. And precision strikes against Iranian missile infrastructure run into the problem that has haunted planners for years. What exactly is targetable at acceptable cost? Iran's missile forces are dispersed, mobile, hardened, and geographically broad. A campaign to meaningfully degrade them would not be a clean, punitive strike. It would be a war prolonged, escalatory, and region-wide. That war would activate Hezbollah, the Houthis, Iraqi militias, and potentially wider regional infrastructure targets. It would carry enormous costs in American casualties, global energy markets, allied cohesion, and domestic politics. This is why Washington looks paralyzed. Not because it does not understand the problem, but because every available solution is worse than the pre-crisis assumptions on which American strategy was built. The resupply question deepens the crisis. 40 F-35s cannot simply be replaced overnight. The United States cannot pull that many aircraft from its own force structure without weakening other theaters. Production cannot close the gap quickly. Even the question no one wants to ask publicly has now become unavoidable. If Nevatim could be hit like this, what does that imply for Al-Udeid, Al-Dhafra, or Incirlik? Those bases are not built to absorb concentrated precision ballistic salvos of this kind. The silence from Washington on that point is itself telling, and Gulf states are watching. Every regional capital that built its security architecture on the assumption of reliable American military primacy is now reassessing that assumption in real time. For Israel, the crisis is not merely material. It is doctrinal, psychological, and existential. For decades, Israeli deterrence has rested on the conviction that however dangerous its environment, it retained one decisive advantage: the ability to dominate the skies, strike first, strike deep, and impose costs no regional adversary could match. That foundation has now been fractured. 40 destroyed F-35s means a severe degradation of Israel's most advanced offensive air capability. The remaining aircraft, now dispersed, are more survivable in theory, but also more vulnerable in practice to follow-on targeting. Iran now controls the tempo simply by having demonstrated that it can strike again. This changes every front. Gaza operations lose depth of air support. The northern front with Hezbollah changes immediately because Hezbollah now knows Israeli air punishment is less assured. Syria, where Israeli aircraft routinely struck Iranian transfers and Hezbollah-linked targets, becomes a much riskier operating environment. Weapons pipelines that were previously vulnerable may now flow with far less interference. The economic shock is enormous. $4 billion in aircraft losses alone, before factoring destroyed support infrastructure, munitions, fuel, and hardened shelter loss, is a blow without modern precedent in Israeli military history. But the deeper damage is psychological. Iron Dome leaks could be rationalized. Missile defense limits could be explained away so long as the broader myth of invulnerability remained intact. But 40 F-35s destroyed on the ground at Israel's most important airbase is not a leak. It is a breach in the foundational promise itself. The question now being asked inside Israel is no longer marginal. It is central. Does the current security framework still work? That is the question governments have spent decades trying to prevent from becoming dominant. Now it has become unavoidable. Step back from the immediate strike and look at what this means in the larger geopolitical frame. This is not only a military event. It is a visible signal that a broader shift long underway may have crossed from gradual erosion into decisive change. The post-Cold War order in the Middle East rested on two linked assumptions: American military primacy and Israel's permanent qualitative military edge. States that aligned with that order received security guarantees and economic backing. States that resisted it absorbed sanctions, covert pressure, isolation, and the implicit threat of force. Iran resisted it for decades. And now, after years of maximum pressure, Iran has demonstrated a capability that directly punctures the military prestige on which that order rested. That message will not be lost on the rest of the world. For Russia, a Middle East crisis that consumes American attention is strategically useful whether Moscow acts directly or not. For China, the strike is both an opportunity and a validation. An opportunity because weakening American credibility increases the value of Chinese diplomacy and capital, and a validation because Iran's success mirrors, in smaller form, elements of China's own anti-access logic in the Pacific. For Gulf monarchies, the reassessment is immediate. The states that have quietly hedged between Washington and regional accommodation with Iran will accelerate that hedge. The ones that relied most heavily on American guarantees will ask whether those guarantees remain what they once seemed to be. For India, Pakistan, Turkey, and others, recalculation begins as well. This is what real geopolitical inflection looks like. Not one dramatic declaration, but thousands of simultaneous strategic updates in capitals around the world. The era of uncontested Western military primacy in the Middle East has been weakening for years. Last night may be remembered as the moment that weakening became undeniable. A new Middle East is being born. Its rules will not be written by one outside power imposing order from above. They will be negotiated among regional actors who now possess or have now demonstrated genuine strategic agency. Iran has earned a central place in that negotiation, not by rhetoric, but by capability. And that is the final meaning of last night. What burned at Nevatim was not only aircraft. What burned there was an assumption that technological superiority, alliance backing, and inherited military prestige were enough to guarantee dominance indefinitely. Israel woke up this morning without the offensive air force it relied on. Washington wakes up without a clear military option that does not carry severe escalation risk. And Tehran wakes up having demonstrated that strategic self-reliance, pursued for decades at enormous cost, can become real military power. That is why this night matters. The question now is not whether the old playbook still works. It does not. The question is whether anyone on the other side has the strategic wisdom to recognize that fact before this conflict moves into a far more dangerous phase. What comes next will matter enormously. But what happened last night has already changed the region.